I can barely hear her.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. Can folks hear me all right? No? Okay. Is that a little better? Okay.
Little.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes I have issues with my microphone. I'm Maddie. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her. And I'm on staff at Earth Ministry with Jessica. And I'm also a member at University Unitarian Church in North Seattle. And the more I learn about I didn't learn about PFAS at all until I started working at Earth Ministry. And just the more I learn about it, the more I'm excited to talk to other folks about it. So I'm really glad that you all are here. Um, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with just a short presentation.
While Maddie is presenting, can we ask everybody to mute your audio and then we'll have time for questions and comments after.
Okay. All right, I've got my right tab open. So I'm glad to hear that folks have a little bit of background information and knowledge about PFAS. So I'll just go through really quickly what PFAS is, how do we get exposed to them. So PFAS are a class of chemicals that have really interesting properties. They are non-stick. They're often, used in things like Teflon, water resistance, like in Gore-Tex. So they have these properties that make them really useful, for lots of things. They just also happen to be really toxic, which is the problem. And, like Jessica said earlier, they're forever chemicals, and they essentially don't break down in the environment in any of our lifetimes, basically. So the problem is, once they get out into the environment, they're really toxic. They last a long time. And, PFAS, there still is a lot of research being done on PFAS, but PFAS has been linked to many different health issues, including some types of cancers, thyroid issues, fertility issues, and it seems like they're always doing new studies and finding, what other health problems that can be caused by PFAS. So it's not something we want to have around. And, how are we exposed to PFAS is one question a lot of people have, because you think a lot about, okay, Teflon in our nonstick pans. I think that's the first thing that people think of when you think about PFAS. And it's actually in a lot more consumer products other than just, maybe nonstick pans. It's in a lot of carpet treatments because it has stain resistant properties. And so people are mainly exposed to PFAS through consumer products like carpets, textiles, and your Teflon pan that everyone thinks of. But another big source of exposure to folks around the country and in our state is through drinking water. So if PFAS gets out into the environment and gets in drinking water, because it doesn't break down, it ends up in drinking water and ends up in people's bodies that way. And so that's probably, I think, the number one biggest problem and biggest exposure in our state is through contaminated drinking water. So this all might sound kind of depressing. When I first learned about PFAS, it was like, oh gosh, this is a really big problem, and it's really affecting people's health and people's lives. But I always like to tell people to remember that we live in a state that's doing a lot of work on PFAS compared to many other parts of the country. And Washington is widely considered the leader or one of the leaders in the country on PFAS regulation, which is really good. So, you know, we're not powerless. There's a lot we can do around advocacy on PFAS issues. You know, it is a big problem, but that's why we're here today, is to talk about what we can do about it and not, you know, get too upset or depressed about it. So Washington is doing, I just wanted to go through really quickly some of the things that Washington is doing on PFAS. There's a program called the Safer Products for Washington program, which comes from a bill that Earth Ministry helped pass a couple years ago in the state legislature. And that bill requires the Department of Ecology to look at to come up with some products that have certain kinds of toxic chemicals in them, including PFAS, and look at and see, you know, are there better alternatives that we can use to still have these products, but have them be less toxic and not contain PFAS. So that's kind of what the state is doing on the level of, you know, trying to get PFAS out of consumer products. Another big thing that we've been involved in within the past couple years is the Department of Health, Washington State Department of Health, is currently working on setting a drinking water standard for PFAS in it, because, you know, national EPA right now doesn't have a specific standard for drinking water that says, you know, this is toxic and you shouldn't drink it. They have what's called an advisory level, but it's really great that our state is taking you know, this into their own hands when there's been lack of action on it at the national level through EPA. So that's, you know, something we worked on within the past couple, you know, half a year, I would say. And they're gonna, you know, that process is ongoing. It takes a while, and we'll be sure to update you all about, you know, when there's more input needed for, you know, a strong drinking water standard. Washington has also banned, through another bill that Earth Ministry was involved in a few years ago, banned PFAS in food packaging. So a lot of food packaging used to have PFAS in it to prevent the grease from soaking through, like, say, a burger wrapper or something like that. And, you know, if it's right next to your food, you probably are ingesting a certain amount of it. So it's really good that it's not going to be in food packaging anymore. And, you know, I talked a little bit earlier about how drinking water is probably the biggest exposure folks get, how folks get exposed to PFAS in Washington. And that initial contamination in our state happened through the use of firefighting foam that has PFAS in it. And so, you know, when this foam was first used, folks didn't realize how much PFAS was getting into the drinking water, the groundwater. And now that we realize that communities across the state have been affected because of, you know, this firefighting foam running off into, you know, water sources and getting into drinking water, now firefighting foam that contains PFAS has been banned in the state. So that's really good. And, you know, the first bill that was passed a few years ago around this had a few loopholes, and those loopholes were closed to this past year with the passage of another bill. So it used to be that certain, like, oil refineries tend to like to use this type of foam a lot. So there's sort of a double whammy of fossil fuel and chemical industry there. But now, you know, studies have shown there are safer alternatives and foams that work just as well that don't have PFAS. So, you know, that's cutting down on a lot of the future contamination that could happen. The problem is PFAS hangs around for so long that we're going to be dealing with what's already there for a really long time. So that brings me to the Chemical Action Plan, which is our main thing we're going to be talking about tonight. And Jessica will be talking about how we can all comment on it and advocate for a strong chemical action plan for PFAS. So this is also something that the Department of Ecology is doing right now. They've come out with this really long, it's like 400 pages or something, I want to say, PFAS chemical action plan. And it's a plan for the state that identifies health, human health, and environmental impacts from PFAS in all, in all areas. And then it also suggests strategies to reduce or eliminate those impacts. And just the plan is very long, but I want to go through just really quickly what some of the highlights are, so to say, or what the main areas, the chemical action plan, or CAP. I'll refer to it as CAP probably from now on, so you all know what I'm talking about. So because drinking water is such a big issue here in Washington State with PFAS in certain communities, not everywhere, the first section is all about ensuring that drinking water is safe, because folks get exposed to PFAS through drinking water. There's also part of the CAP that talks about managing PFAS contamination that's already out in the environment. And that has to do with cleanup, and measuring, what does contamination look like in certain communities across the state. And then the third part of the CAP is about reducing PFAS in products. And that goes along with what I was saying earlier about the Safer Products for Washington Act, which has to do with consumer products. And so that's sort of woven into the CAP here, even though it's a separate program in the Department of Ecology. And then the last part of the CAP talks about understanding and managing PFAS in waste, because, when we have products that have PFAS in it, that all ends up in our landfill. And it's really not, I don't think, widely understood what if there's PFAS coming from landfills or waste sites, and what that effect is on human health and the environment nearby. So that's another part of the CAP. And that brings me to some of our main talking points about this chemical action plan, and what we're asking the Department of Ecology to, change in their CAP, and what we're hoping you all can ask them to change as well. There's a lot in it. Some parts of it are great, and they're doing a lot. And it's great that our state is doing things on PFAS, but, at the same time, it's a really big problem, and we need to, take it seriously and do as much as we can on it. And so, also connecting to our faith values, loving your neighbor isn't polluting your neighbor. And that's, one big thing I try to think about when reading a big technical document like this is we can understand or not understand as many technical aspects of it as goes, but we really, it comes down to these faith values of transparency, accountability, stewardship, responsibility, and commitment, which are just some of the language we've used here. And along with that, it's currently PFAS isn't designated as hazardous in the state of Washington, which means it's not considered part of the state's Superfund law that requires contaminated sites to be cleaned up. So if we can get PFAS designated as hazardous, that can go a long way towards, making polluters pay, which is another one of our talking points, because that's hard to make happen if it's not designated as hazardous. Another thing is that, there's currently, the chemical action plan doesn't talk about sludge as having a standard. And sludge is sort of biosolids, or sludge are two words to kind of describe, what comes in from sewage treatment plants. And it seems like we really need to address PFAS in that, and that's not currently part of the chemical action plan that we're asking them to do. And then, PFAS isn't just one single chemical, it's a whole class of chemicals that all have similar properties, but, there's often this whack-a-mole style substitution of PFAS chemicals where they just substitute one chemical that we know is really dangerous for another chemical that really hasn't been studied and could be just as dangerous, but it has one slightly different atom or something like that. And so we really want to make sure ecology is looking at PFAS as a class and not just at, the two, quote, worst or maybe most infamous PFAS chemicals, which are, one of them is PFOA, which I think I heard somebody mention in their introduction. And then, because these chemicals are forever chemicals and they're not going anywhere, it's really important that we shorten the timeline for regulating PFAS in products, since that's, stuff we're getting exposed to daily. And our goal in doing this webinar is to inform people about PFAS a little more, but you don't have to be like a super technical PFAS expert to really care about this and know that it's, morally wrong that these chemicals are out in our environment and in our communities and in our drinking water in certain cases. And so that, if you all have questions about specific parts of the CAP, I can answer those at the end after Jessica shares a little bit about advocacy. But right now I want to, hand it off to Reverend Laura to talk a little bit about, more about why we care about this as people of faith.
Thanks, Maddie. This has been a great introduction to some of the chemistry as well as some of the advocacy work that's already been happening. So this has been great. So I just want to share from my location, which is a Christian pastor, and I realized that as an interfaith, multi-faith organization, we have people who don't come from the same tradition as I do, so I can only share from where I am, but I would love to hear from some of our other participants how this resonates with your faith tradition as well. So I'll just preface my remarks with that. But as a chemistry teacher and a pastor and a mother, there are few issues that connect all my roles as much as perfluoro or polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is what PFAS stands for. So as Maddie has just been describing, there are about 4,700 substances that fall into this category, and they're manufactured for a variety of reasons. As a chemistry teacher, I can marvel at the ingenuity that people have had in developing ways to use these substances to solve problems and design solutions. And as a teacher, I also recognize the need to teach young people that using Earth's resources is not the same thing as exploiting them and leaving a mess for those who come after us. As a pastor, I recognize both the gifts that have been given to us through creation and also the responsibility that we have as stewards of it. And as a mother, I want nothing more than to leave my daughter a world where her creativity and ingenuity is valued, and also a world where the water is safe to drink and the soil is safe for growing food. PFAS chemicals are compounds that people made and designed into applications, all the kinds of things that Maddie has been talking about, waterproof raincoats and umbrellas and firefighting foams and nonstick coatings for cookware. And the problem is that they stick around forever, and they don't stay where we've designed them to be. The compounds are pervasive and persistent. They don't break down. And eventually, once they're made, they find their way into water and soil. The production of these compounds has introduced trace amounts into almost every living organism on the planet. Almost every waterway and stream now carries, along with life-giving water, enough of these compounds to cause harm. And Maddie's already talked a lot about the kinds of harm that can be caused. So we need to advocate for three things. One, stricter regulation on their production and disposal. Two, that organizations and companies and governments will continue to design replacements for PFAS whenever possible. And 3, for collaboration in the remediation of the already contaminated water and soil. So there is no developed country in which water is free of PFAS, and there are no humans in developed countries whose blood is free of PFAS. This is a group of compounds that doesn't degrade and that accumulates in living organisms. It's already affected the lives of many people. And of course, as with most environmental crises, the people who are most affected are the people who are most marginalized. As people of faith, we know that our call to justice is true, and we respond when we see those who are least able to afford to choose alternatives being most affected. For those of us who are from Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we may have heard the call of the prophet Amos before. He said, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." We know that we have work to do. Justice is not being served when we look the other way and let PFAS compounds be discharged into our waters. Justice does not roll down like water when we look the other way and chemical companies discharge PFAS and precursors that make PFAS downstream into aquifers and surface waters. Justice and righteousness are not what flows like an ever-flowing stream when we make uninformed choices and unknowingly increase the demand for products that contain PFAS. So as people of faith, we know our call to justice and righteousness. As people of faith, we respond when we hear that call. As people of faith who are called and ready to respond, I think we're ready to take the necessary steps to reduce the harm that's already been caused and to prevent further harm. And so may justice roll down like waters again through the rivers and the currents, and may righteousness flow again like a stream across this land. And of course, may our children and grandchildren know that we stood up when we had the chance, that we made a difference, so that the waters of justice and righteousness, as well as the waters of planet Earth, can flow again once more without so much fear of unseen and unknown toxins. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Pastor Laura. That was like a mini PFAS sermon. I love it, and appreciate you bringing in the prophet's wisdom there. So before we go into our advocacy training, I've seen a couple of questions pop up in the chat. So I will open a bit of time for us to ask a few more clarifying questions about PFAS. But I do want to reiterate Maddie's point from earlier, which is that you don't have to know all of the nitty-gritty about this topic in order to speak up on it. We are showing up as people of faith, and that is what we'll talk about more with our advocacy messaging. But to ensure that you feel comfortable with the topic, I do want to see and hear and answer some of your questions. So I see in the chat a couple of questions from Janet. Janet, do you want to share your questions?
I guess my thing is, why do we even use these chemicals if they're so dangerous? Why don't we just ban them completely? And for the products that are still on the shelves that have them, are they labeled?
Yeah, good questions, Janet. PFAS is not generally labeled in consumer products, which is a problem. I think there are certain products that are used by children. Jessica, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I think there are some children's products that manufacturers do have to disclose if they have PFAS in it, but that I believe that disclosure is to the Department of Ecology, and you can find it online, but it's not necessarily when you go buy a product. You know, it's something, but it's not the best that it could be set up as.
Maddie, can I respond to that as well?
Yeah.
A little bit? Yeah. So in the research that I did, I found that like Maddie said, usually they don't label that there is PFAS, but there are a few companies that will label really conscientiously when there is not PFAS. So if you're looking for waterproof rain gear or umbrellas or things like that. There are a couple of companies that do make a PFAS-free line, and there's also waxes that you can get to make them more waterproof, because that is why people buy them usually. But that it's a pretty safe assumption that if you're looking at a fabric product that's been made to be waterproof, it's got PFAS in it, unless it's labeled as not.
And to go along with labeling, sometimes, oh, can you hear me? Okay. Sometimes folks will label and say doesn't contain PFOA, which is one type of PFAS, but that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have any PFAS. It could have just one of the other chemicals. So that's a big problem. And Janet, to answer your other question about, why do we use them? Well, the properties are pretty remarkable. I think chemists, think the properties. I studied chemistry in college, and it is pretty remarkable, the properties that they have for nonstick and to be nonstick and to repel water and stains and all that stuff. But also, it's important to acknowledge, I think, that chemical companies have made a ton of money off of this, and that they kept making it because they were making a ton of money off of it, even when they knew it was toxic, and even when they knew it was hurting their own workers that were making it. So it really comes down to that profit and money, I think.
And the film that Earth Ministry has been showing in houses of worship all around the state is called The Devil We Know. And that gives a great overview. It used to be on Netflix. I'm not sure if it still is, but you could check for it there. So that really tells the backstory of the industry footprint on these chemicals and how they knowingly introduce them and spread them so broadly. Okay, we've got time for maybe one more question if there's a inkling you have out there, or I can move into advocacy. Okay, so let's talk advocacy. As you know, most of you are familiar with Earth Ministry, and we very much value putting faith into action. And we also want to make that as easy as possible for you. So Earth Ministry does have a comment form. Perhaps, Maddie, you could find the link and put that in the chat for folks, but we will also send this all to you in an email follow-up. So we do have a comment form that is live, and it has those faith talking points that you saw in our slide presentation earlier. So the most basic way to speak up is to just write your name in that form and click submit, and it will get sent off to Department of Ecology. Now, of course, we love when you can take the time to personalize your comment and share a bit of your story. That always adds more impact for the folks who are on the other side of that email and opening it, seeing, oh, this isn't just the same. There's a different story here. There are also opportunities to speak up at public meetings that are happening within the next week. So we will talk now, and Maddie will pull up some slides that I will use to just walk us through what does it look like to speak up and advocate as a person of faith. And we can do that within the context of this topic. So we're going to start with a really story-based approach to advocacy and to sharing our values and really naming them. So our goal here is to move a bit out of the head and more into the heart, to share the values that ground the reason you showed up tonight, the reason you are taking time to write a comment or testify. I think often we're tempted to hit folks with the facts, but really communication experts have found that it's the stories and the heart of an issue that is what really will move a decision maker. So, if you think about it, think about the things that keep you up at night, right? They're not maybe hearing numbers about tons of carbon, like I don't know what a ton of carbon actually looks like, or tons of PFAS contamination, but it's hearing about, oh yeah, I heard a kid at a press conference talking about how they thought that everyone just has asthma, that's how it is, because they only know bad air quality in their communities. And that's not the future that we want. And those are the stories that stick with us. So leaning into story and claiming it as powerful. I think also we're tempted to kind of minimize ourselves and say, oh, well, maybe I'm not a pastor, or I'm not a chemist, I'm not this or that. I'm an average person. Awesome. Awesome, awesome. You are an average person, and that is powerful. And you are a citizen and somebody that these agencies are hired to represent and need to hear from in order to know how to represent them best. And each of us carries a story. Each of us carries the values that bring us to this. And together, collectively, that makes a much stronger movement. So even if you're writing to somebody, just say, I'm a person of faith, and I live in Spokane, and I care about this. That is an awesome starting point. So then you take your starting point and you're gonna try to wrap your story kind of around a fact. So if there's something that Maddie or Laura shared tonight that was especially alarming for you, we're not gonna say don't use any facts at all, but maybe take one fact and wrap your story around that and say, wow, this really struck me because I'm an aunt, and I know that my niece is growing up with her face around the carpet all the time and breathing in the chemicals that are settling there out of the dust from the contamination in household products. Finally, it's important to, when we're talking through this as a story, you're kind of the hero of the tale, and it's important to remember that the villain is not the people that you are speaking to when you're advocating. We can hold a lot of resentment and anger, especially around, for me, especially around toxics, and the agencies that we're talking to are doing what they can to address that. And yes, we're asking them to do more. But the ultimate villain in this story is, oh, and I apologize, this is from, I didn't change this from a previous PowerPoint. It's not the fossil fuel industry, although we aren't a fan of them either. It's the chemical industry, which are really the backers of using products with these chemicals, although we don't need them. So not villainizing, the staff member of Department of Ecology who has to sit through the 3-hour meeting, but instead keeping in mind our villain. So on the right-hand side here is some examples of values that we can name to get really specific. Some that apply here include safety over profit, clean air and water, treating all with dignity and respect, responsibility. We just share these. There's many more, but these are to kind of get your ideas going. Maddie, let's go next slide, please. Okay, so Earth Ministry likes to encourage you to break down your comment or testimony into 3 pieces. So the first piece is identifying who you are. So sharing a piece of your identity personally, and then also your community. So that would look like saying, my name is Jessica, I'm a person of faith, and I'm an aunt, like I had said. And I'm also a member of Earth Ministry and Ballard First Lutheran Church. So when you take that time to share a bit about who you are, it could be that you love orcas. Orcas are especially impacted by PFAS. You are a swimmer yourself. You're a person who drinks water. Like, pulling out a piece of your identity that's a bit specific and that your story is going to revolve around. And then the communal part is really important because it shows that you are representing a broader community. So a strength that we have in advocating as people of faith is that the communities in which we worship are coming together around shared values. So it's true, you can't say everybody at your church or synagogue or mosque thinks exactly like you do about this specific issue. You're not speaking for them in that way, but you can say, hey, we share these values of stewardship, of justice, of a clean legacy, and this does not align with that. So it kind of amplifies your voice and kind of brings in a cloud of witness, so to say, behind you. Our second piece is around what you value. So that's when we go back to that list and really pull out what seems most applicable here. What is it in your gut that really draws you to this topic and to what you feel with your spirit is ultimately right here. So for this topic, it's strong PFAS protections, getting them out of our drinking water and out of the products we're using all the time. And with that, bringing in values like we said before of clean water, of responsibility, of a commitment to a cleaner future for future generations. So naming those values. And then finally, the last piece is, of course, saying what you want. So in this case, we want these points to strengthen the PFAS cap. And we have those specifics. Earth Ministry has those specifics. Those were formed in coalition spaces with partners through the Toxic Free Legacy Coalition, of which Earth Ministry is a member. So we encourage you to use those, but then also to share the ultimate vision of what your quest is, what you really want, which is a clean and healthy future, right? And you can take that in various directions again. Your vision could be, wanting a future where everyone can turn on the tap and know their water doesn't have PFAS in it. You don't have to be a chemist to go shopping or worry about looking for labels that say this does not have PFAS. So paint that picture of what you're advocating for. Okay, I think for time, we might pass on this next piece. Actually, no, let's go for it. Let's watch a sample testimony very briefly. So this is another topic altogether, but I want you to listen for those three parts. So Pastor Nancy here is speaking to this Tacoma City Council. It's about some land use work, but within that, listen for those three parts being, who are you? What do you value? And what are you asking for? What is the future you want to see?
Good afternoon. My name is Reverend Nancy Faree Clark. I'm a recently retired United Methodist pastor, a proud resident of Tacoma, and a member of Earth Ministry. You may know that we recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Marking that important date brought back memories for me of the first Earth Day during my junior year in high school, when I and my classmates were dismayed to learn that our planet was in serious trouble due to human intervention. We vowed that we could do better. I grew up on a dairy farm, so I have always loved nature, but I have also learned from my faith that environmental stewardship is not optional. God calls us to tend the magnificent creation which God has given us in order to preserve and protect it for the good of all people. This belief has been central to my life and ministry for many years. 50 years ago, I was hopeful about resolving the environmental crisis, but in many ways it has only worsened. Now we understand the devastating impact of greenhouse gas emissions, yet we continue to rely on dirty fuels, even as time is running out for saving our planet. The current COVID-19 crisis is showing us the inextricable connection of human health, the environment, and the economy. Fossil fuels clearly contribute to an increase in pollution and related health issues. Yet, to have a strong economy, we need healthy people. We must stop sacrificing the health of many for the wealth of a few. I believe we have a moral obligation to cut emissions now in order to create a just economy and a healthier world. Recalling my vow to do better many years ago, I am still hopeful that we can work together to resolve the climate crisis. As I look out on the beauty of Commencement Bay from my living room each day, I am grateful for the gift of this special place and the commitment many have made to protect it. I thank the City Council specifically for not allowing new fossil fuels in Tacoma while the Tide Flats sub-area plan is being developed. But we need stronger protections. I urge you to do better by strengthening the interim regulations to include a ban on expansion of the existing facilities. Your leadership can help save our planet and heal our community. Please do what is right to help provide a healthy and sustainable future for us and generations still to come. Thank you.
Whew. Yeah, Pastor Nancy. So that was her first time testifying. And we worked together on her testimony, and I am always happy to do that with you as well, if you feel compelled to do so after tonight. But let's look at her pieces really briefly here. So she shared her identity as a pastor, as a longtime resident of Tacoma. She shared her connection with Earth Ministry, which we always appreciate. She shared some of her values woven in with her story there of thinking back to when she was in high school, vowing to be good stewards. She named safety over profit as a value and looking at economic recovery, and also a value of adaptation of, hey, we don't have to do it the way we've always been doing it. We can paint this vision of a future that is better for future generations and that prioritizes health and well-being of all in our community. And then she got specific with her ask. So that is an example for you. And I know we're close on time here, so I want to go to our last slide briefly. This is your opportunities to comment. So like I said, Earth Ministry has a form, and we make it nice and easy for you to personalize it and send in a written comment. And we will, I believe that got thrown in the chat, but we will also send you a follow-up email tomorrow morning with this information. Then there's these 3 public meetings at which they'll share a bit more about PFAS, and you will have an opportunity to comment there. So that's if you're feeling really passionate about this and want to speak out. We would love to have you participate. It's really powerful to have a faith presence and just the presence of real people in those meetings, because a lot of times who shows up is industry, the people that are paid to be there. And that skews our perspective a bit, you can imagine, for decision makers. So we will send you this information. Maddie, you can stop with screen share, please, so we can see you all. There you are.
Yeah, Jess, can I add something real quick?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, you know, in this age of COVID, all these hearings are online, and they usually are audio only and won't show the video of testifiers. So if that's something that makes you nervous, they won't see you, they'll just hear you. So you could wear your pajamas or whatever and be comfy and, you know, be able to testify really strongly without having to get up in a room in front of a bunch of people or like, you know, deal with your video on Zoom or something. So I just wanted to add that really quick.
Yeah, great point. And it is, you know, you can just read right off of your paper too. We really do recommend folks write out your testimony. So taking these 3 sections and just writing out, you know, about 1 page, size 14 font, double spaced, is about 2 minutes. So write it out, practice it a little bit. No, you could just read off if that's more comfortable. We are up at the top of the hour, but I would, I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions about the advocacy portion of this. And I'd also love to hear if anyone is interested in testifying. And if you need to hop off, we totally respect that.
I just have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any intersectionality here between this and our, what is it, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, those populations? Is there a cross? In other words, do they get hit harder?
Yes. Yeah, the short answer is unfortunately yes. I think Laura touched on this a little bit, that the communities who are impacted most are often those with less resources, and a whole different load of systemic injustice weighing on them, preventing the ability to, do the research about what rain jacket to buy, right? So low-income communities that are communities of color are especially hit hardest. And we see that, in the contamination areas in Washington State. So Airway Heights outside of Spokane is highly contaminated, and I believe a more diverse part of the region. Also, there's an area south of Tacoma that's pretty polluted, and then on Whidbey Island. All three of those are located close to military bases, like Maddie said, so also military communities being highly impacted. But I really appreciate you raising that, Mary Ellen, because it's so important to draw clear lines in the intersections of environmental justice and racism, and seeing who's impacted.
And I'll just add really quick, there are, for certain communities around the state that do have drinking water contaminated by PFAS, it costs a lot of money to put in a filtration system into your county water or local water system. And that, costs a lot of money. And, one of the few places in the state that has one is Issaquah. And I think that's largely because they could help pay for it.
Mm.
Interesting.
Yeah. You could also think a lot of these communities are trying to depend on bottled water. And in some, when the contamination is so bad, like that's given out, but in others, like that's an added expense that not everybody can afford. It's also, not sustainable. As we all know, plastic pollution is its own issue. Any other last thoughts or questions?
Are there ways to get this stuff out in filters in your own home? In other words, do any of the filters,
like a Brita filter or the
filter
you put on your faucet? I don't believe so. Laura or Maddie, speak up if you know.
I did see some research about that there are some ways. I don't remember if there's a certain brand that does it or not, but I did see something about a water filtration system that can be used by homeowners, but I don't remember the specifics of it.
Well, that's some good news.
Yeah.
But I'm sure I would say it's probably not in your average water filter, like a Brita filter that you would fill up to drinking water from.
I think Brita, I was reading something recently that said Brita could help, but it doesn't get it all out, I don't think.
Right, because we're talking about 4,700 chemicals. It's hard to have one filter that can target all of them. Some of them are polymers, and so they're big, and so they're going to be caught by some of the more standard filters. But the smaller molecules, they're going to have a harder time getting caught.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, so I want to close by saying, please be gentle with yourself around this topic. I know when I first started at Earth Ministry, I just remember being really heartbroken working and learning about toxic contamination in our water and homes. And we can do what we can to combat that. And we can also, at some point, have to kind of speak up, do what we can with the products we use, and let go and let God, and know that we can't control it all. So be gentle with yourself as you let this topic sink in. I'm happy to be a conversation partner further. And please do fill out Earth Ministries form and raise your voice, and contact me if you would like any help with testimony for these public meetings. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. It was great to see you.